A reading of the book, Narrative Dynamics, written by Melanie and Phillips, co-creator of the Dramatica theory of story. Chapter 7. Dynamics Quads. Part 2. We now arrive, at last, to the subject of this chapter, my new discovery that finally allows me to bridge the gap from the dynamic questions, the fourth aspect of the current structural model, the current superclass, to the next superclass, the structural view of dynamics. It began, as stated, with my recent ponderings as to what dynamic quads would contain. Specifically, as my mental example for a thought exercise, if the current pair of dynamics of time lock and option lock were in a quad, what would the other two items be? I tried a number of different candidates, but all of them were insufficient to the task. They did not meet all the requirements of a truly balanced quad. But of late, there was one pair that seemed, at least initially, to satisfy all the tests I know for determining if a potential quad is fully functional. This part isn't much of a revelation, just the first step to some really astounding discoveries, but it is an essential step. So, here's the best candidates I had. The promising pair of dynamics was constricting and loosening. Simply put, while the current pair of time lock and option lock describe narratives that are brought to a conclusion by running out of time or running out of options, the new pair describes narratives that, at the conclusion, find time or option constrictions to be becoming tighter or looser. In essence, are time or space opening up into more possibilities, or are they closing down into fewer? Now at first, this didn't ring quite true. There was something about it that bothered me. From a purely structural view of structure, this new pair should be simply a final state of tighter or looser at the end and not the process of becoming tighter or looser. But then I realized that I had it right the first time. This is no longer the structural view of the structure superclass. We are now in the structural view of the dynamics superclass. And so, just as a piece of the hologram has the whole picture but only part of the perspectives, for the first time in my quarter of a century of Dramatica theory development, I had to engage in the one cardinal sin of narrative model construction: never shift perspective. Chris and I drilled that mantra into ourselves all of these years so that the current superclass is all K-based, knowledge-based, while the other three superclasses would be T, A, and D-based, thought, ability and desire. KTAD are the mental equivalents of mass, energy, space, and time. They are the mental harmonic of the physical world, for any dynamic system that is generated from a structure will reflect the same patterns as the structure from which it is born. In other words, form and function follow each other, just as our mental dynamics lead us to reorganize the universe in our image, structurally. But in this case, we have actually moved for the first time into a new superclass, the T, thought, superclass. And therefore, while the development of this new model would also require a consistent perspective, it would, naturally, be a different perspective. So, recognizing that the structural view of structure could only see half of the quads of dynamics, then the other pair of dynamics in these quads would need to be seen from the T superclass perspective. And, from that point of view, processes cannot be seen as states, as having tightened or loosened by the end, but as processes, tightening or loosening by the end. Subtle but essential, for wherever one might begin to pull a loose thread to unravel the new dynamic model, all that follows will grow from these first seeds. As a side note, I expect that in the final superclass, the dynamic view of dynamics, it will require a continuously shifting perspective within the model itself, rather than a consistent one, as it must represent, ultimately, the rate at which the nature of change is changing as one process iterates into another. Back to the subject at hand, there is a second thought exercise I had been cogitating upon yesterday while making the 90-minute drive back to my home in the mountains from a meeting at Wright Brothers, the company Chris, co-creator of Dramatica, co-owns with Steve, programmer of the Dramatica engine. This thought exercise was, if we think about something round and round in circles, such as worrying about the potential outcome of something, our anxiety grows and grows. Why does this happen? And how is it reflected in the dynamic model I'm building? This thought came about because we had to re-register our car in California when we moved back here from Oregon for the project I'm doing with Wright Brothers Incorporated, WBI. I had been putting the smog check off to the last possible minute before the deadline because the more I thought about the ramification of it possibly failing the text, money, inconvenience, perhaps the need to buy a whole new car, the more anxious I became. And yet, there was no new information, just running around the same mental circle over and over. Still, with every circuit my anxiety grew. How is that reflected in the current model? It isn't. Clearly it is a dynamic, so how would it be reflected in the dynamic model? Didn't have a clue. Then, this morning, I put 2 and 2 together and combined my thoughts about tightening and loosening with the problem of increasing anxiety from an unchanging mental process endlessly repeated. And it hit me. Mental processes don't operate in a vacuum as it would appear in the structural model. Rather, they generate results. They create product, they manufacture yield. Every process manufactures something. In the case of my smog check, the yield was increasing amounts of anxiety. The more I thought about it, the more anxious I became. In the dynamic half of the time lock/option lock quad then, it wouldn't be about process but about yield. Essentially, are the result of the narrative such that the constriction of time or options is becoming tighter or looser? Extending this, might not the whole next superclass, the structural view of dynamics, be looking as the results or yield of a narrative, the increasing or decreasing forces at play? I think so. I believe this perspective defines the nature of the new dynamic model, how building or diminishing forces influence one another in a series of ups and downs by every point measured until the end of the narrative is defined by reaching an equilibrium, not a fixed state as in the structural model in which all processes of change have ceased and all potential is gone, but in a stability of ongoing processes in which, collectively, all forces hold each other in check and no further increasing or decreasing of any of them will occur. Well, then, what does this mean to the current model and how does it fit in with my other recently published speculations about the nature of narrative dynamics? The first thing that came to mind was a recent article I'd written describing how new patterns can be formed in the mind and then locked in place impervious to any internal ability to change them, and how external forces can be applied to the mind to effect change from the outside. The mind is a closed system, just as narratives are closed systems. They deal only with the elements within the narrative, which is the scope of the story, and make the assumption that no other forces outside that scope have any impact on the narrative. In real life, which narrative seeks to document, our minds are constantly assaulted by forces outside our own internal cogitations. How others respond to us or act for or against us and physical maladies that have nothing to do with the nature of our mental processes yet greatly affect their operation are both examples of why our minds are not truly closed systems. While the operating systems of our mind may be closed barring physical damage to the brain, just as the structural view of structure never changes in an unbroken narrative, forces outside the system will determine the patterns into which it falls, just as the dynamic model, the structural view of the dynamic superclass, works outside the current structural model to determine how the structural operating system of the narrative is twisted and turned. The 8 pairs of dynamics in the current model are not the outside forces of change themselves, just the tip of the iceberg, the interface between structure and dynamics as seen from the structural side, the other half of the interface being seen from the dynamic side and the additional 8 pairs of dynamics, such as tightening and loosening, that will complete the quads of dynamics, complete the hologram. In my previous speculative article, I compared mental states, or patterns of cognition and/or affection, emotion, to standing waves, ongoing forces that have reached an equilibrium within the mind. But why would such patterns maintain themselves, as commitments and responsibilities, as obligations and rationalizations, in the face of external pressures that should alter them? How do patterns of the mind end up fixed in place, like prejudice or fixation, like a black hole in space that exerts gravity but will not open up regardless of the outside environment? In the article, I used a personal experience that Teresa had related to me to describe how we initially respond to our environment to achieve equilibrium with it. But these are merely standing waves of processes, like the new dynamic model, that are easily undone when our environment changes. But if the external forces that established these standing waves are suddenly removed, like moving out of a family due to an argument or like having a sudden relief of anxiety, it is like compressed gas in a can, being suddenly released, it chills all that is around it and freezes things in place, in this case mental patterns. If the release of pressure is gradual, there is no chill, no freeze, and the standing waves realign. But if it is fast enough, the effect will range from a firming up into slush, increase in resistance to change, to a complete freeze, maximum resistance to change, and that pattern will remain until another outside force melts what has been previously frozen. To unfreeze, new pressure must be brought to bear on the mind with sufficient speed to create heat enough to melt the previously frozen patterns. This compression can happen quickly for a flash thaw, which is the equivalent of a leap of faith where a character changes its nature in an instant, to a slow thaw in which a character is gradually warmed into flexibility. And, naturally, these processes can completely fix in place or remove patterns of mind, but may also only serve to make them slushy. And so, we return to the new dynamic model, the second of the 4 superclasses, in which tightening or loosening are the dynamic side of these interface quads. While the current structural view of the structure model describes how forces completely freeze or melt patterns of mind, the new structural view of the dynamics model describes how patterns of mind are made more sluggish or more slushy. If the current superclass is focused on determining position, the new dynamic model will focus on velocity. The third superclass, dynamic view of structure, will center on changes in velocity, and the final superclass, dynamic view of dynamics, will explore changes in the rate of change of velocity. So, it all ties in together: structure, dynamics, a fluid mind, or one firming up through the 4 quads of justification, as seen in the current structural model as progressing from knowledge, thought, ability and desire to can, need, want and should, through situation, circumstances, sense of self and state of being to commitment, responsibility, rationalization and obligation. Next step: figure out the other halves of the other 7 dynamic quads and then use that information to iterate into a complete dynamic model of identical size and resolution to the current structural projection. Oh, and the car passed the smog check.